In this video I want to speak about a subject that is not very often discussed. Yet, death is something that all of us will experience sooner or later, and that is the inevitable consequence of having been born. I want to reflect about how we can help people and ourselves to die with dignity. In April 2003, while I was a final year student at the Scottish Baptist College, I was also a student chaplain for a few weeks at two big hospitals in Glasgow. I was focused on the cancer wards of the Western and Naval hospitals, where I was learning under the watchful eye of the Reverend Stuart MacDonald, who was then the minister of Knightswood Baptist Church. I was on a final year placement from the Scottish Baptist College, and the placement was to help me to grow in understanding. It was for me to gain new experiences, and it was for me to develop my pastoral care skills in what would be a very demanding and a very difficult environment. Thus, when the placement ended, I would be required to evaluate my pastoral care skills from the placement, and I was to integrate biblical narrative, theological principles, and the practice of pastoral care. In the environment of the cancer wards of two very busy Glasgow hospitals, I also had the opportunity to grow in understanding about the need for human beings to be able to live and to die with dignity. I will always be grateful to the Reverend Stuart MacDonald for allowing me to be alongside him for that placement time, and for him trusting me to get on with being a student chaplain without him feeling the need for him to be always looking over my shoulder. In the midst of wards of people who were suffering greatly with cancer of one kind or another, I wanted to be able to help them cope with life and impending death in any way I could. As a student chaplain on that placement, I usually went around one or more of the oncology wards in the morning and spent time just being with the cancer patients and talking with them as much or as little as they wanted to. As I approached one bed, I could see that a man, probably in his 40s, had major scarring on his forehead. I introduced myself, and he told me that his name was John, though I've changed his name for the sake of confidentiality. John told me that he had already had surgery for a brain tumour, and that he was now awaiting the results of further tests so the doctors could decide on their next course of action. We talked about his home, his family, and we explored the context of where he had come from to arrive at this point. I also shared about my own context and life experience and why I was in the hospital, as well as discussing with John my personal call to pastoral ministry. John seemed to be reasonably hopeful that the doctors could do something good for him and that he would be able to get back to normal life in the near future. I was back on that same ward a week later, and for the first time I met and talked with a ward sister who had been on holiday the previous week, so I had not met her back then. We discussed issues related to people whose life was suddenly disrupted by the discovery of cancer. Sister spoke of how the control of your life can suddenly be wrenched from you by finding out that you have an inoperable brain tumour and that you would therefore be dead within a matter of weeks. Though she did not name names, I knew who she was talking about, and I said so to Sister. And I then related to her the conversation that I had had with John the week before. Sister then told me that John had effectively known that his situation was terminal as long ago as the week before I had actually met him. However, the final confirmation had been given to him in the last couple of days, and that he would be going home to sort out his affairs and to die. I went out from Sister's office, and I began my round of the ward. I had not been on the ward very long at all when, in the course of me walking between two sections of the ward, John and I almost bumped into each other. I looked into his eyes and I asked him how he was doing. Tears filled his eyes as he said quietly, "They've dealt me my cards." I suggested we go to his bed and sit down together. We sat down together on his bed, but all he could do was tell me once again that they had dealt him his cards. I couldn't say anything, and all I could do was to put my hand on his shoulder. A few seconds later he excused himself because he said that he wanted to go for a cry. While I was a student hospital chaplain during that placement, I was very aware of the real tension between me being just a student chaplain who was on the wards to learn from others, and the fact that patients nevertheless often related to me as if I was a full professional who was competent to do the job, or else I wouldn't be there at all. I was then, and I still am, very aware that I do not have all the answers. In fact, I am certain that I have very few answers, if I actually have any answers at all. The close inevitability of death often causes in people an unparalleled sense of fear, combined with an unparalleled sense of panic in that person concerned. At a personal level, I had already had my own experiences of how people handle dying, not just their own terminal process, but also the final days of other people who were around them. This was true not only in my immediate experience of my own close family, but also in observing how professional people handled people who were dying right in front of their eyes. In speaking about the many people who are professionally involved with the dying, Odin, in his book Pastoral Theology, said that only the fact of death is dealt with, not its meaning. How then could I bring meaning to a dying human being? It is relatively easy for me to rehearse ahead of time what I might say when confronted with a person who is in a situation like that, as was being experienced by John. It is altogether a different thing when you are suddenly face to face with someone who will soon die, and you did not anticipate the meeting. When I found myself in just such a situation, I felt a helplessness to actually do anything, but I also had a real unwillingness to use words cheaply. I wanted rather to have what Lyle in his book Integrity of Pastoral Care called the grace of having nothing to say. If I am truly honest, I also had an overwhelming desire not to be in that situation at all. However, running away was not an option. I was there, and I had to be able to practice what Lyle called support without interfering. Wilcock, in his book Spiritual Care of Dying and Bereaved People, addressed how I felt in that situation when he said, "The addressing of our own helplessness is necessary to stop us running away, or taking refuge in false optimism, or withholding from the dying person permission to explore with us their fears and their grief. But to give a dying person the permission to explore with me their fears and grief only finds true meaning if I too am exploring and knowing myself in the same way. That is true because it is helpful for me to know what I am like in my inmost being, and to know by looking at who and what I am in the light of the Holy Spirit, who shows me what I am truly like in her eyes. Would a dying person engage in that kind of self-exploration as I spent time with them? Surely it would be a little easier if the reassuring presence of the Holy Spirit could be sensed through my own openness and honesty. I must let the dying person know that I have not come to preach at them, that I am not there to convert them. No. Instead, the person needs to know that I am there to love them, even as Christ loves them. I must try to work out what that looks like for the person that I am with. I do not want to threaten them, I do not want to interfere, and I want them to be comfortable with me. In the light of even my own limited experience, I could understand why, in the face of terminal illness or death, evangelical hardness and legalism must give way to truly loving people as Jesus loves them. I can understand why loving people is far more important than winning converts, that being a true friend with people is much more important than preaching at them. These words from the Church of Scotland's A Church Without Walls report are surely important here. This is what it said. Here, friendship is about commitment to each other and openness with each other. I can understand why so much of church does not touch people's real lives, and I can also see why it does not help them when they are asking the serious questions of life and death. These questions are not only on the lips of the dying, but also on the lips of their relatives too. It is easy to be trite, to be neat, and to be theological clever. But where is my love? If people cannot share their lives with me, how will they ever share their death with me? As a student chaplain, I was meeting some people who were caught up in what Newland, in his book How We Die, called the system of modern dying in the modern hospital, which is where people slip towards their modern death. Yet, as Newland said, if a young doctor learns no more important lesson than the admonition that he must never allow his patients to lose hope, even when they are obviously dying, how much more must those of us who call ourselves Christians bring a real hope to the dying? Can I be short on answers, but yet full of love for dying people? Could I be a person of hope for someone whom medical science now terms as a hopeless case? As I went out onto the hospital wards to do my round on each of the mornings that I was a student chaplain, I would look through the windows of each section that I approached in order to get an overview of the patients who were in that room before I went in. This routine quickly became a habit, but so too did my inclination to think about patients, and I had to constantly remind myself that I was not in the hospital to see patients. I was there to meet with people who were in need of people, who would accept them as people, and who would love them as people. Likewise, in a church context, it is very easy to have a system of pastoral care that treats people's needs without ever drawing close to the people themselves. That is actually very easy to do. Someone presents their problem, you present a prayer, and Yahweh presents an answer. Simple. I wish. It does not always work out like that. John taught me afresh that I too am a person who needs love, and that I will often find love as I give love. John taught me afresh to try to value every individual member of the human race, even as Yahweh surely values them. We can, of course, know what we ought to do, but knowing how to do it can be quite a different matter. When I met John, I met someone whose greatest need was to know love from someone who could be more than a friend during his time of greatest need. Though he may not have verbalized it in this way, he needed someone to love him. Someone who would love him not because he was terminally ill, but because he was a person in his own right. Though he might not have said it in this way, he needed someone who would love him as Jesus loved him. Indeed, John would almost certainly not have verbalized it in that way. Nevertheless, that is what he really needed. Someone to accept him and to care for him as Jesus cared for him. Gone was the time for scoring theological brownie points or notching another convert on the hit list. For me in that situation, it wasn't even important that I tried to analyse what John was feeling or what he was going through. I just knew that he needed someone to be there and that I was there. Like Newland, I would listen more to the patient and ask them less to listen to me. In this student chaplain, John found a non-threatening person with whom he could share his profound sense of personal shock. I found someone with whom I could share my profound sense of personal love. John may have felt that the giving in our times together all flowed just from me to him, but I knew better than that. Switzer, in his book Pastoral Care Emergencies, spoke of the dying person's need to express their feelings to others, but the man that I was with in John had not yet been fully able to express his feelings even to himself. Therefore, he needed, and indeed he had asked for, the time and space to go and to face up to his own feelings. At that moment, John was not able to personally come to terms with his situation, let alone to begin to sit down and think through the consequences for him and his family. As Switzer rightly said, we are to move at their pace, not ours, with the degree of openness they desire. Yet, that is a difficult balance if, as Newland said, the person does not want to exercise their right to independent thought and self-determination, in other words, their control, because they cannot yet face the truth of their own impending death, and so they block out the news that they don't want to hear and just try to live in a world of make-believe in which everything will be just fine. John had spiritual needs, but in specific terms those needs were largely unknown to him then. He was still speaking of cards being dealt to him by the doctors, and possibly, to some degree at least, holding the doctors responsible for what was happening to him. Their bad deal had given him bad cards, and perhaps it was for him the doctors who caught the brunt of it, for the game had turned sour. I think it is a good, though not easy practice to be honest with people about what medical science can or cannot do for them, but when it comes to the giving of bad news, how they are told and by whom is of critical importance. In my personal view, junior medical staff should not give senior news, and impersonal staff should not give personal news. Switzer discussed the fact that some patients refrain from being honest, some doctors refrain from being honest with their patients about their terminal illnesses because they did not want to destroy their hope. But my very limited experience causes me to dislike what he called a temporary but needed denial, because it suppresses the human instinct to face up to and to deal with what is happening to them. It also turns life into the embodiment of perception, and in doing so, it turns Yahweh into the embodiment of theology. Everybody wants a good God who only gives good news, and no doctor wants to be the bad God who is the bearer of bad news. I have observed that many doctors are exceedingly uncomfortable with the impending death of their patients, and I can understand that, because as Odin pointed out, doctors' time-honoured medical ethics centres upon sustaining life rather than dealing with death. Impending death spells out the fact that the doctors can do no more for the body. Newland asked why, when doctors can do no more, they still keep up the busy paraphernalia of scientific medicine, keeping a vague shadow of life flickering when all hope is gone. Yet, Newland himself found that avoiding this busyness was easier said than done when his own brother was found to have a massively invasive cancer. Hope of a cure may be gone, but there is still hope. The human doctors may not be able to do any more doing, but they can still be human beings. As Newland said, a promise we can keep and a hope we can give is the certainty that no man or woman will be left to die alone. To be a human being is to be in relationship with other human beings, for we are a human race, not merely a collection of individuals. My friends are valuable to me for who they are, and what they do is seen and known by me in the light of who they are. While Switzer does not explicitly say this, he does imply that what a terminally ill patient needs is the human being rather than a human doing. A dying person needs someone who will be right alongside them and who will be very careful in their use of words and deeds. But isn't that also true for every person in every minute of every day of their lives, regardless of their circumstances? Surely church has often fallen into the trap of having members, but forgetting that the church is people. Church should never be a mere institution. To paraphrase Switzer, the first absolutely crucial issue in terms of willingness and ability to work helpfully with other people is who we are as persons. Now, many factors of my life have made me what I am, and many people have contributed to my being as a person. Whether good or bad, right or wrong, I do not always know, for these things cannot always be clearly discerned. But one thing I know, I am me. But I know a second thing, Yahweh is God. And I've discovered what Wilcock has called windsurfing on silence, as Yahweh and I have been together in different situations, with sometimes both of us saying and doing nothing. I am a human being, and Yahweh is who and what they are, and we are together. For a precious few seconds, and with my arm resting on John's shoulder, we windsurfed on silence together. Regardless of faith or lack of, and as our bodies touched even so briefly and lightly, we were sharing Wilcock's grace without the weariness of negotiation or the fear of compromise. Human being, simply but profoundly touched human being. My words with John had been very few, but there was a togetherness that words could easily have destroyed if they had been used unwisely. I treasured the brief times that I had with John. I treasured the privilege of simply being human with him and making no demands of him. It was simply one human being with another human being. And through the average human being that I am, another human being was being touched. What Yahweh was doing in John I do not specifically know, neither do I know the seed that they may have planted in John. But I am certain that John would remember our brief times together, and I am equally certain that words could never describe the togetherness of human being to human being. So thank you, John. Whenever and wherever I am, I pray that Yahweh will reach out and touch other human beings through me, and that I may not be obsessed with merely getting results. May I be ever focused to see and to know Yahweh's touch to me from people who are not obsessed with getting results, but who just love people. I pray that Yahweh will use others to touch me, and may they be near to me when it is my turn to ask the hard questions of life and death on my own behalf, for ask them I surely will. If not today, then tomorrow. The writers of the Psalms frequently asked Yahweh many hard questions, and often they did not receive any answers. But they often received Yahweh, who was and is the answer. May I too receive Yahweh, who is the answer. For Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. In whatever circumstances I find myself in the future, may all those who have known me also have known something of Jesus through me. May all those who received me have received something of Jesus, for in him I live and move and have my being, my human being. May those who know me ever help me to guard against my relying on simple answers and mere formulae. May those who know me ever help me not to rely on my own wisdom. Meeting with John did not shake my confidence in Yahweh, the God of love, but rather it increased my love for Yahweh, who is love. I pray that I will never shirk from being with people who are struggling in life's most difficult circumstances, and may those people remember my love, not my easy answers. O Yahweh, don't let me be indifferent to the pain of others. Don't let me turn my face away. Don't let me hide. Don't let me run away. Let me look into the eyes of the broken, of the dying and the bereaved, and in looking let me care for them as you care for them. Don't let me give false hope to the dying, but let me give them real hope that springs from eternity. Don't let my heart grow cold to others. May my love always be more evident than my limited theology is. And Yahweh forbid that you, Yahweh, should ever be reduced to being the embodiment of my theology. Keep me ever looking into your eyes, Yahweh. Then I can look into the eyes of others. Keep me vulnerable, even as you are vulnerable. Let me, like Cassidy said in his book Light from the Dark Valley, reveal to people that they are lovable, lovable to me and lovable to you, Yahweh. The lovable are valuable. They are valuable to me and they are valuable to you, Yahweh. As I meet suffering human beings, let me bring to them the love of the suffering Yahweh. Before I come face to face with my own death, may I make that awesome holy journey for myself, and doing so, care wisely for those who make it now, for I always need a bigger knowing of Yahweh. I will both live and die better if I know the sacred necessity of abandonment to Yahweh and their gospel of grace in Christ. Doctors see patients and they treat diseases, but I want to care for people. Each and every person is loved by Yahweh, for Yahweh is love. Thus, Yahweh, let me be love, nothing more and nothing less. Let me, like Clark, in his article Minister to the Dying, represent a quality of care and love which brought the universe into being and which even now surrounds each needy soul. By this may people know that I am your disciple. By this may John have known that I was your disciple. By this may John have known dying with dignity.